Okay, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're unlocking a playbook that's going to completely change how you command a room, and, more importantly, how you inspire real action. Whether you're pitching to a board, leading a massive all-hands, or just trying to sell a new concept to your team, we have all felt that immense pressure of standing up and needing to deliver. But here's the secret. True influence, it isn't magic, and it's definitely not some innate talent reserved for a lucky few. It actually has an anatomy. It's a structure with bones, a nervous system, and a heartbeat. So we're breaking down the anatomy of influence to give you the exact tools you need to stop just surviving your presentations and start genuinely transforming your audience. But before we map out our strategy, we really need to face a stark reality check. Human attention naturally fractures after just 47 seconds. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. You literally have less than 1 minute, a remarkably narrow window, to hook your listeners before their brains start scanning for distractions, checking their phones, or, wondering what's for lunch. We've all been in that audience, right? If you don't capture them immediately, you're going to spend the rest of your time fighting a losing battle against their wandering minds. So, to beat that 47-second clock, we're following a precise blueprint. We'll cover the presentation paradox, architecting your narrative, mastering executive presence, adapting to the medium, and finally, securing long-term impact. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the presentation paradox. The paradox here is that presentations are never just an information dump. I mean, if people just needed facts, you could have just sent an email, right? Instead, think about the difference between an amateur and a true executive. An amateur's goal is basically just survival. They just want to get through the material without stumbling, so they end up delivering this exhausting chronological wall of data. But an executive, they act as a catalyst for change. Their goal isn't just to talk, it's to change how the audience thinks, feels, or acts. And they pull that off by curating a narrative arc that specifically solves the audience's problem. They aren't reading a script, they're empathizing. So how do you actually achieve that kind of executive confidence? Well, it all comes down to the spotlight shift model. Most speaking anxiety happens because the spotlight is completely on yourself. You're worrying about how you sound, if your hands look weird, or what people think of you. Focus on self equals anxiety. But the second you step out of your own head and mentally project that spotlight onto your idea, everything changes. You become the channel, not the subject. It instantly converts self-conscious anxiety into genuine audience connection, because suddenly you're serving the message, not your own ego. Which leads us beautifully into Section 2, architecting your narrative. Once your mindset is dialed in, your message needs a rock-solid foundation. It always has to begin with knowing your why for impact and your who for empathy. Because if you don't know what challenges your audience is facing, your words are just going to be background noise. This is where the rule of 3 narrative arc comes in. First, capture focus immediately in that first 30 seconds with a hook, a story, a wild statistic, a deep question, just get them. Second, move into the body, but limit the cognitive overload to exactly 3 main points. Human working memory maxes out incredibly fast. If you give them 10 points, they'll remember 0. Third, anchor that momentum with a strong close featuring a single, definitive call to action. Don't ask them to do 5 things. Ask them to do 1 thing brilliantly. And to support that crystal clear structure, you absolutely must abandon the visually uninspiring rules of the past. The old 5x5 rule was supposed to be a safeguard against text walls, but let's be honest, it usually just resulted in death by PowerPoint. We have to adopt the modern standard. Aim for 1 major idea per moment, using robust, high-quality imagery and vast white space. The key takeaway here is that your presentation should act as a cinematic backdrop that enhances your voice, rather than a projected script that competes with it. Now, let's look at Section 3, Mastering Executive Presence. With our narrative built, this is where the rubber really meets the road. Interestingly, your delivery actually begins long before you speak a single word. It relies heavily on a pre-stage ritual. You've got to arrive early to map the environment, walk the space, test the acoustics, check the clicker. Then, read the room. Listen to the presenters before you so you can reference their points and make your session feel instantly interactive. And please, ditch the rigid word-for-word script. Use simple note cards with high-level talking points so you can maintain a fluid, authentic, and genuinely conversational flow. When you do finally step up to present, you need to physically anchor yourself to find mental clarity. I love to use the grounding tree metaphor for this. Think of your body balancing 2 opposing forces. The downward forces are your roots, feet shoulder-width apart, deep, steady breathing to quell the jitters and lower your center of gravity. Then you have the upward forces, the branches, maintaining an open, upright posture and projecting your voice clearly from the chest to command the room's acoustics. This physical stability directly translates to perceived authority. That physical grounding is what unlocks the entire delivery ecosystem. It's like a set of interlocking gears driven by authentic authority. Once you're grounded, you can fluidly integrate vocal variety, altering your pace and pitch to keep their brains engaged. You can utilize open palm gestures, which actually subconsciously signal credibility to the listener. Combine all of that with active listening and consistent direct eye contact. Remember, if you hold their gaze, you hold their attention. All right, moving on to Section 4, adapting to the medium. Because let's face it, not every presentation happens on a brightly lit stage anymore. The skill sets required for physical versus virtual environments are entirely different. In-person engagement, the room, feeds off your physical presence, your vocal projection, and your ability to read the audience's micro-expressions in real time. But the screen, virtual or hybrid setups, that is a totally different beast. Because physical energy is muted on camera, the screen demands high-energy visual pacing, constantly breaking up dense information. It also demands intentional interaction pathways. You can't just talk at a screen for 45 minutes. You need forced engagement like polls, chat prompts, and dedicated pauses. Plus, you need extreme technical flexibility for when, not if, the Wi-Fi drops. Finally, we reach Section 5, securing long-term impact.
So you've nailed the delivery. The crowd applauds, but does your core message actually stick? Well, here is the terrifying truth about the default memory decay curve. Your audience is going to retain a mere 10% of your presentation after just 1 week. Just 10%. Think about all the hours of preparation you put in, only for 90% of it to just vanish from their minds in 7 days. It's a harsh reality of human memory.
To combat this massive drop-off, strong leaders don't just vanish after the applause fades. They engineer the curve upwards. Instead of accepting that default plunge into forgetfulness, you have to flatten the decay curve by sustaining momentum. You immediately share resources, you answer follow-up questions promptly, and you relentlessly reiterate that single primary call to action through other channels. You literally have to actively fight to keep your message alive in their ecosystem. So how do we bring this all together? Mastery is ultimately found in integrating all these elements into this blueprint of influence equation. You take audience empathy and narrative clarity, that's your core message. You multiply it by executive presence and visual simplicity, that's your delivery. And it's only when these forces combine that you achieve the ultimate goal, meaningful change. None of these elements function effectively in isolation. The whole shebang has to work together. Influence isn't some magical innate talent. It is a calibrated skill set. It takes preparation, it takes empathy, and it takes deliberate structure. So the final question I'm going to leave you with is this. Are you going to keep just surviving your presentations, or are you ready to start engineering true transformation? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and I highly encourage you to try out these frameworks the very next time you step into the spotlight.